Welcome to all of you. I'm Jody Waterhouse, and I'm with the CU Anschutz Multidisciplinary Center on Aging. The CU Anschutz Multidisciplinary Center on Aging and the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs Aging Center are the co-hosts of this spring emotional and mental health webinar series. Many of you participated in our fall webinar and winter webinar series, so welcome back. And for those of you that are new, we're thrilled to have you for this spring session. Just a couple reminders that we have 2 more sessions left after today. So next Thursday, April 29th, we will have Alyssa Kolva, who will be addressing adding structure to life with flexibility and purpose. So looking forward to that. And then we will round out our spring session on May 6th with Maintaining Healthy Cognitive Living with Dr. Tara Carlisle. So I'm thrilled again to have you. Please check your email following this presentation because in that email is a link to the evaluation. It is very important to us that we get your feedback and also some ideas about the other program topics that you would like to hear. So that helps us build the calendar. We've already started to outline schedules and calendars all the way through spring of 2022 for this webinar series, since it has been so popular. So watch for your email on this summer for the fall session. I'd also like to thank Denver Public Library, who is our community partner for this series. And as I reminded many of you last week, they do have a mindfulness webinar series, which is a great follow-up to last week's presentation with Dr. Samantha Farrow, who addressed a mindfulness topic. So just be aware and visit their website if you would like to take a deeper dive into the mindfulness topic. Also, during the presentation, as you think of a question, please type it into the chat box, which is located at the very bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring that chat box. So at the end of the presentation today, we will have a Q&A session and we'll make sure that Mary has your questions. So please make sure to put your questions into that chat box. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Mary O'Hara is a licensed clinical social worker with over 15 years in the field of aging and neurological disorders. She has experience working in a number of different settings that include a diagnostic clinic and research center, in long-term care, and most recently as a private psychotherapy practice. She has dedicated her career to supporting the mental health and well-being of older adults and their families. So with that, please help me welcome Mary O'Hara.
Hello, everyone. I'm so honored to be here today. Thank you, Jody, so much for the invitation. As Jody said, I'm a social worker here in Denver, and my practice is really focused on aging and mental health. And so I'm really excited to be here today to be speaking with all of you about a topic that is very connected to our mental health and aging. And that really is understanding loneliness and the search for meaningful connections in our lives. It's such an important topic that I think deserves more of our attention and exploration and just a deeper collective understanding as a culture. So my hope today is that you take away some ideas and some things from this presentation that you can integrate into the communities where you live and where you work. So these are just the objectives that I'm going to be covering today. I'm going to be talking about the meaning and the history of loneliness, understanding its relationship with physical and mental health. We'll talk about some initiatives that have been created in response to loneliness, and then also explore how we might create more opportunities for connection in our personal lives and also in our communities. So let's begin just by sharing a definition of what loneliness is. It really is a subjective perception that there is a gap between how connected you want to be and how connected you actually feel. People with very small friend groups can actually feel very meaningful connections and very fulfilling connections. And conversely, people with very vast social networks can be left feeling empty and that those connections are not meaningful. And it's really interesting because we are meaning-making creatures, we have this ability to make meaningful relationships when in fact there might not be any reciprocity there. So maybe it's a podcast that you listen to, or a book that you're reading, a character in a book or on a show that you feel a connection to, but there really is no reciprocity in that relationship. So we have this, again, this ability to make meaning when there might not be any reciprocity there. So in this sense that it's a subjective experience, it's a state of mind. It's not actually a state of being alone. It's also thought that loneliness is an alarm system, just as hunger tells us to eat and thirst tells us to drink. Loneliness is thought to be very deeply wired in our DNA that signals us that we have to go out and seek connection in order to feel safe and secure. It's also thought that loneliness can be so universal. We can experience it at any age or any stage in our lives. If you've ever felt homesickness, if you've ever felt the bereavement, if you've ever felt the torment of unrequited love or feeling shunned, these are all versions of loneliness. And I think what is confusing for some of us is that it's not a single emotion. It can be a cluster of feelings that include sadness or shame or anxiety or fear or depression or grief. And we also know that there's this paradox to loneliness, that loneliness begets loneliness. So when we start to feel lonelier, it's harder to climb out of that. It becomes a really vicious cycle that we can fall into. It's also thought to be socially contagious among our friend groups. If people on the phrase of our groups start to drop out because of loneliness, others in the group are vulnerable as well. We have strong evidence that there are connections with our mental and physical health. It's thought to be as damaging as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And we know that it has implications for depression and anxiety and low self-esteem and sleep problems. Think about the practice of solitary confinement in our prison system, this very distressing experience that people are placed in, and essentially they're disconnected and socially isolated, causing this experience of loneliness. Some states have identified this as cruel and unusual punishment. So I think it just speaks to how distressing social isolation and disconnection can feel. And then I wanted to make a note so that it's something we're all thinking about, is we do have measures that are validated that we use to understand loneliness in research. But people might define loneliness really differently. So even just the question of, are you feeling lonely? I might identify with that word loneliness, but someone else might say, no, I'm not lonely, I'm just socially disconnected. And similar, along those same lines, we might in our research not even be reaching the loneliest of the lonely. So it is something that we need to be thinking about as we are looking at and understanding loneliness. Another thing that complicates this experience is ageism and stigma and the myths about loneliness. The myths being that only it would, if someone was an introvert, or if they were depressed, or if they're shy, or they have marginal social skills, that they would be more likely to experience loneliness. And we know this is not true. Very type A personalities, the life of the party, can also experience loneliness. It's really hard to talk about. People might not be comfortable saying, I'm feeling lonely, or on the other side of that, people might not be comfortable hearing that someone is lonely. We might be really comfortable with that idea, knowing that someone close to us feels lonely. People might not share the feelings of loneliness because they fear pity, or they fear being blamed for feeling lonely, or just even dismissed of, you have so many friends, I just saw you last week, you should be so grateful. And it really invalidates their experience and internalizes something that that maybe there's something wrong with me. I do have so many friends. Why do I feel this way? And so the experience can be really confusing. Like I said, it can be a cluster of emotions that can be misunderstood. Our reluctance to acknowledge if we're experiencing loneliness also complicates it. And then there's a term, ambiguous loss, that's used quite a bit in anticipatory grief, where there's a physical presence but an emotional absence. And I think this is important to acknowledge in our relationships, that we might be living with other people, so we are physically present with them, but emotionally very unavailable to them, or they are unavailable to us. And that compounds this experience. So there are many types of loneliness, and I'm not going to cover them all. There are many subtypes, but I did want to just talk about a few today. The first one being situational loneliness. So something like COVID-19, this pandemic, it's situational. We know there will be an end. It's gone on for a long time, but it's due to a certain situation that we feel lonely. And then there's transient loneliness, which is really loneliness for short periods of time. It's usually the result of a really particular situation, even the situation of something like a rainy day. And then beneath that, we have a term we call chronic loneliness, which is more persistent, often experienced for many years. And it occurs regardless of the situation that a person is in. And it seems to become more internal in the person. They start to have low self-esteem. They start to feel inadequate. And it feels so unrelenting and just always present. And then beneath that would be existential loneliness, this deeper questioning of, how do I fit in the universe? Does my life have meaning? Does it have purpose? This really intolerable emptiness and nothingness. And all of these are so important to distinguish from social isolation. Social isolation really being the distance you have from others, whether that's geographically or because a person is homebound. You can be socially isolated, as I said, and still have meaningful connections, or you can be socially isolated and feel lonely. So I wanted to just dive a little bit further back into a brief history of loneliness. The term loneliness first crops up in about the 1800s in the English language. And before then, the word we often saw was this term oneliness. And it was really associated with solitude, the state of being alone, not colored by any emotional lack or any negative experience, but really a very necessary place for you to be with God, in reflection with God, or with your own deepest thoughts. And since God was always nearby, you were never really alone. I came across an interesting fact that I wanted to include. Loneliness was actually included in a glossary of infrequently used words in the 1600s. And it really was used to describe what we would now call social isolation. So places or people who are far from neighbors. Skip forward a century or two and we start to see loneliness appearing, and it is burdened. It is burdened with emptiness and this lack of social connection, seeing people as separate from the social fabric. And we see this come about at the same time of this rise of individualism. And then fast forward to the 21st century, where we're now calling this an epidemic. So what is the picture in our culture today? Is connection really receding from our lives? I came across an interesting study that was asking different generations about how they felt about the importance of community in their lives. And younger people didn't indicate it was as important as older people did. So there could be a generational gap between how important connection is in our communities. We know that there are reductions in marriage rates and increased rates of childlessness. There's decreased community involvement. Less people are volunteering. Less people are reporting religious affiliation. We're working longer hours. And on top of that, we need to recognize a new loneliness in this digital world that very well likely is taking away from our meaningful connections. Think about, we can go days without talking to anyone because we can shop online, we can work from home, we can order our groceries. And on top of that, social media and the internet can create so many really negative comparisons that we make, comparing ourselves to other people, other people's lives. Also the silos and the bubbles of conversation, or just this very curated perfection to make a person's life look a lot better than it actually is. And the emojis and the responses in social media, the thumbs up or the smiles, really lack the depth that we would have if we were actually having a conversation. And yet when anyone is asked, what makes your life meaningful? I mean, you can answer this yourself right now. It continues to be connection with the people I love, connection with my friends and family. So we know, and then I wanted to explore this in the context of aging and social isolation and loneliness. We know that loneliness increases as we age, and about 28% of older adults are thought to live by themselves. A quarter of those identify as socially isolated. One Kaiser Family Foundation and another AARP study found that about 40% of older adults express feeling lonely. And of those, 15 to 30% were identified with a chronic state of loneliness. 30% of those were married, and a large percentage of family caregivers identify with feeling lonely. It was difficult to find statistics on individuals who are discriminated against on the margins of our society and their relationship with loneliness. I did find that we know that being a member of society that is discriminated against does increase loneliness. But a large percentage of this example of LGBTQ adults identify as being lonely. And I think that's really important for all of us to know and to be integrating into our conversations about loneliness. So we had a pandemic of loneliness, and then enter in COVID-19. It really shed a light on this experience of loneliness. We all became disconnected. We all became disconnected together. But it's really put it in the public conversation, which is important. We saw rates of social isolation and loneliness increase. Obviously, it took away for those people who felt lonely but were able to get out and be a part of certain clubs or volunteering or certain friendship groups. It took away those outlets. It also reduced the weak ties of connection that we have, the conversations we would have with the dry cleaner, the conversations we'd have with the person at the front desk, the 30-second conversations that we have all day long in passing with people we might not know very well are really important for our well-being. Social connection became actually dangerous. To stop the spread of the disease, we had to avoid this. And it became safer to connect on our phones and our tablets than with each other in person. And we can't talk about COVID without recognizing the unresolved grief that so many of us have felt, and how we have held the weight of that grief, and our relationships have held the weight of that grief because we haven't had the rituals that we might normally have to process and to honor what we've lost. I think if anything, it really reminded us how connected we are and how connected we really need to be. I saw a funny cartoon in the New Yorker last week I wanted to include, just about being alone with our thoughts more frequently in this pandemic. If you can't read it, it says, "I can't wait to forget everything I learned about myself during quarantine." So I think it's really important to also understand the science of loneliness. The science is really trying to reframe loneliness from this state of profound despair to more of a motivational force that's encoded in our biology. The pain of loneliness really being a reminder that we need to rejoin the pack or risk being killed by a predator. So it's really thought to encourage group participation and protection. It's dangerous on the social perimeter. And we've survived as a species because of our social protection, not because we have sharp teeth or sharp claws. It's really the ways that we've protected each other has helped in our survival. So the pain of being alone is thought to motivate us to seek companionship. And even though this is not the case right now, we're not in the same dangers that we were thousands of years ago. Our brains still think that we need to be connected to survive. So even that's not factually the case. Psychologically, we still need this connection. And the idea is that our neurons are trying to help us, to alert us. So our neurons create this feeling of loneliness to trigger that motivation to search for interaction. And when we are unable to connect for whatever reason, after that alarm system goes off, if we cannot connect, we start to click into this fight or flight response. We start to go into this mode of self-preservation. We become hypervigilant. We're looking for dangers, or this is what our mind is doing in response to the fear of being alone. We start to pay attention to negative signals. We start to feel more rejection. We feel very vulnerable and even alienated. And you can imagine how this makes it even less likely for us to engage meaningfully. So it becomes this really negative feedback loop that I'll talk a little bit more about later on. But it obviously harms our efforts to connect with the people we most want to connect with. And it's also thought to increase our cortisol levels, that stress hormone that we know is so dangerous, causing inflammation in the body that's leading to other health issues as well. I wanted to just give an image of the brain to talk a little bit about more about the areas of the brain that are impacted by loneliness. There is research that shows that a lack of social interaction actually can impair brain functioning and affect cognition. So there's 3 areas that we've identified as being affected by social isolation and loneliness. The prefrontal cortex is a part of the brain that regulates behavior and decision-making. And we have studies that show that people who identify as lonely are found to have reduced brain volumes in those areas. Similarly, with the hippocampus that regulates memory and learning, people experiencing social isolation have smaller than normal hippocampus. And similarly in the amygdala, this is an area of the brain that is responsible for processing emotion. And research has found there's a correlation between the size of a person's social network and the volume of their amygdala. Their amygdala are these 2 almond-shaped areas, again, associated with processing emotion. The theory is that the amygdala are smaller in people who experience loneliness. And so I started to describe this, this very negative feedback loop when we are in more of a chronic state of loneliness. So let's say we perceive isolation, that alarm goes off, we're motivated to connect, but for whatever reason we can't. We start to be hypervigilant. We start to be really defensive. We start to only see the negatives and only pay attention to the negatives. We start to think back on memories and remember them in a more negative way. Connections that we have become less satisfying, and that affects our negative moods and our interactions. And then there's this greater likelihood that individuals are going to push away the very people that they want to connect with. And then once this happens, as you can imagine, in a person's social circle, their friends form a negative impression because the lonely person is in fact pushing them away. And then their behaviors towards the lonely person only reinforce what the lonely person's negative perceptions were. So you can see what a vicious cycle it is. But the thought is, if we can intervene in these negative thoughts and these distorted bias of thinking, we can reframe a person's perceptions of what's going on, address those negative thoughts that start to emerge, like people don't care about me, they don't want me around. And you can see how invitations to join a book club or come and be a part of this with us, they won't help unless people can first shed these unconscious bias that keep them from establishing more intimate relationships. So the questions, now that we have this understanding, are how do we stop this feedback loop once it starts, and how do we prevent it from starting at all? So the seeds of loneliness, the beginnings of loneliness, are really an interplay of a number of social, demographic, and health factors. But I think these are really important for all of us to acknowledge, especially those of you in healthcare or working with an aging population, to have these on your radar, that these are risk factors. So if you are working with a client who is a person of color, who maybe is a recent widow, they're grieving the loss of a spouse, maybe they have a history of mental illness and they have hearing loss, you know that they are going to be at risk for loneliness. And your interventions and your interactions with them, just knowing that, can be part of the work that you're doing together to mitigate their loneliness. At a minimum, loneliness really hurts, but we know there are even more serious mental and physical conditions. We know that people who are lonely might be more likely to abuse alcohol, get less exercise. There's a link between suicidal behaviors and loneliness. People are 2 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease or related dementias. We also know that because that fight or flight activation releases that stress hormone cortisol, inflammation is a risk, which has, again, a whole host of risks for poor health. But there's good news. We're talking about loneliness. You're here today. We have a better understanding of it, and there's more research that's looking into how we can prevent, how we can intervene, how people can cope. And there's campaigns to address and loneliness. And I think post-COVID, we are all going to be craving deeper forms of community life and really being thoughtful about what we value most in our community life and shaping how we move forward in that. I think because we know the story of how we got here, just the things I've shared with you, we have an understanding of what's happening in the brain, and we know that there's things that have happened in our culture that have led us to this state and this experience of such pervasive loneliness, that we can find our way back because we understand how we got here. And so it's really a matter of working together to make that happen. So I wanted to share some just interventions that we know can be really supportive for someone who is experiencing loneliness and wants to find more meaningful connection. So there's thought to be 3 types of interventions. There's the environmental, community level of intervening, group level, and then the individual level. So the environmental community level might be more based around urban planning. How do we reduce social isolation and thinking about the social spaces that we create? On a policy level, things like making hearing aids more affordable so that being hard of hearing is not a risk of loneliness, that this can be more accessible to those in need. Groups are another form of intervention to cope with a variety of causes of loneliness, whether it's bereavement or if you are newly diagnosed with Parkinson's disease or a chronic condition, that you can be part of a support group that is there to not only offer support, but also resources and connection. We also have a great deal of evidence that shows that for the chronically lonely, individual short-term therapy, like a cognitive behavioral therapy or other psychodynamic therapies, are most effective. We definitely need more empirically based treatments for loneliness, but there is research that shows that short-term CBT can be really helpful. And for those of you not familiar with CBT, it's a therapy that targets, or the theory is how we think affects how we feel. And so how we challenge any distorted thoughts we might have, or challenge our negative core beliefs about ourselves, and being aware of automatic thoughts that come up, how we can reframe those and challenge those as not really being based in fact. They're likely based in some kind of cognitive distortion. So really working on reframing experiences, which is really at the core of disrupting that cycle that I talked about. I wanted to share some examples of places that are addressing loneliness in some really incredible ways. With an understanding of how much connectedness can shape our health and our well-being, we have to think about the spaces that we might use to foster more engagement and more reciprocity. There's some really amazing models of co-housing where you have your own independent apartment, but then there is a shared kitchen, a shared dining room, a shared living space, a shared garden. So people's paths are always crossing and they're coming together at certain parts of the day. Intentional communities is another thing that's focused on a very ecological and sustainable and intergenerational response to enriching connection. The village movement, maybe you've heard about villages. I think this started back in Boston a number of years ago, and it's spread all over the country. We have one here in Denver, A Little Help. But the village movement is really focused on aging in place. And so using volunteers in the community to help aging adults stay in their home if that's what they'd like to do. And so if you are an adult who lives in a community with a village model, you can join the organization. And if you need help with your taxes, if you need help changing a light bulb or with some yard work in the spring and fall, you call upon the volunteers of the village, or in this case, A Little Help here in Denver. So it's an organization you can join to receive the support. It's also an organization that you can volunteer in. And I speak from experience, it's a wonderful organization to be a part of. I also love the idea of kind of reevaluating our real estate choices. You know, we often choose the places we live based on kitchens and bathrooms and closet space. But what if you know, those things aren't going to prevent loneliness as we age? What if we were more focused on, does this have a path outside that I might cross my neighbors on when I'm on a walk? Is there a town center nearby? Are there benches? Is this space inviting for people to gather? We know that these designs do have limitations for the chronically lonely who maybe are already self-isolating because of their loneliness. And we know that these won't repair actual social networks, but the thought is, can we create a scaffolding against loneliness to at least minimize the experience for people? Just going to have a conversation with someone or just a 60-minute visit is not going to reduce loneliness. It might feel wonderful in the moment, but after you leave, the person might still feel lonely. And so we know that what makes connection really meaningful and what makes those bonds is a feeling of reciprocity and is a feeling of action in a sense. And so there are a number of outreach campaigns that have focused on taking this action. There's a program called the Unloneliness Project, which uses the creative arts as that action of doing, that action that creates reciprocity, that creates that meaningful connection. There's a wonderful program called Men's Sheds with the theory that men don't talk eye to eye, they work shoulder to shoulder. There should also be women's sheds, let's just say that. But the idea is that you can join a men's shed, be part of creating these sheds together. It's woodworking, it's connection, it's bonding, but you're not sitting across from each other looking in the eye over coffee. You're creating something together. There are a number of friendly collar programs. A number of hospitals or community agencies have established these, where the agency or the hospital is reaching out to patients in the community, patients of the hospital or of the agency, clients of those places who might be at risk for loneliness. And then there's also hotlines that a person who is feeling lonely might call. There's one out of London called Silver Line, and I read a little bit about it. And they say that people who are calling, which they get so many calls every day, are not talking about loneliness. They're calling because they want to share a new song that they just learned on the harmonica, or they want to share a dream they had. Again, that reciprocity. I want to share something that's going on in my life. So it's rare that people bring up loneliness. It's more about connection. In Zimbabwe, there's a wonderful model of these friendship benches where people are actually offered a short-term evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy with a therapist on a bench in a secluded area. But this is an intervention that they've come up with. And then a number of health insurance companies have started initiatives and started their own programs around loneliness, knowing that loneliness is an expensive issue if it's causing so much physical and mental, so many physical and mental issues. So we're starting to see health insurance companies come to the table as well. Again, these programs have limitations for the chronically lonely who might not be able to attend some of these programs or willing to call. I use mindfulness quite a bit in my practice, and so I wanted to go through an exercise of moving through loss and disconnection or loneliness through a mindfulness lens. And so I invite you to do this with me, whether or not you're feeling lonely, or maybe you're just feeling lost, or maybe you're feeling some kind of disconnection. So one of the first things we would start to think about is acceptance of this feeling. Not that you're okay with it, but that it's just here right now. And we need to acknowledge that it's here, notice it, allow it. Again, you're not okay with it happening, but you're allowing it to be here because it's here. And just understanding the contours of it. What does it feel like? What comes up for you? How would you describe that feeling in your body? And if it is painful, just acknowledge that pain without any kind of judgment or any kind of blame on yourself or other people, just witnessing that pain. Attending to it with some compassion, some kindness. Maybe think about what you might say to a friend who's experiencing something similar, and say that to yourself. We seem to be so able to be hard on ourselves, and it feels really fake to be nice to ourselves, but that's in fact what we really need to be doing. I think it also requires us to have this duality in our thinking, this both and. I can feel lonely and take steps towards finding meaningful connection. That things can coexist, even if they feel in contrast with one another. Starting to challenge some of our own negative thoughts, or just being aware of the story we're telling ourselves. What is the story you've told yourself about why this has happened, or who is involved? Just be aware that it's just a story. You might not have all the facts right, but this is just a story that you've told yourself about the situation. Exploring what expectations you might have of other people and how that disappointment comes up in you. Explore if you have expectations of what relationships should be. Should is a really dangerous word. And so just being aware of what expectations you have, and then looking for the good in others, looking for the good in this situation. Maybe you're not as socially connected as you want to be right now, but maybe there is a really friendly relationship that you have with a neighbor or with someone else in your life. And we need to see the positive as well. So looking for the good in a situation right now. Being curious about your role in what's going on right now, or maybe the armor that you've put up, recognizing any blind spots or barriers that maybe you have created, and exploring if self-protection, which is such a normal response, explore how that may have been harming you, especially now what you know about the brain. Taking responsibility for your own agency and the things that you can control, not necessarily waiting for people to come to you, that you can reach out to. And instead of this question about why am I lonely, what is at the root of, well, instead of asking why am I lonely, asking what is the cause, what is creating this dynamic that I can control? Where do I have agency that I can control? We know that wonderful quote by Viktor Frankl, that in between a stimulus and a response is a space where we choose how to respond. We choose how we want to respond to a situation. And I think this is this is something I do quite a bit in my work, but looking to our values to guide us towards greater connection. So kind of turning the page on loneliness or loss or disconnection, to examine what is the pain of it telling us that we need? What values is it pointing us to? Maybe it's that you want to reconnect with a part of your culture. Maybe it's that you want more creativity in your life. Maybe it's that you really value trust and love and compassion. And so these are things that you can take action on with your values as your guide. And they can guide you into really taking slow steps of reaching out, of maybe sharing, of taking steps to join something, going slow in doing that, but using our values to begin that process. And I think values are also an incredible tool in finding connection, even if you're not feeling lonely. What is most important to me right now? And it changes through different periods of our life, but how can I use that as my compass right now? And again, this practice of self-compassion, being kind to ourselves, not only in this time of COVID, but in any kind of loss, in any kind of feelings of disconnection or loneliness. There's a practice of self-compassion where you recognize how painful it is, what you're going through. Remember that you're not alone in this experience, and saying something kind to yourself. Again, maybe something that you say to a friend. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how to enrich connection. There was a study out of Harvard University that started back in 1938, and it's one of the longest running studies in human development. And the study was determined to examine what makes us happy. And key results showed that happiness and health aren't a result of wealth or fame or working hard. Instead, it comes from our relationships. So just as we know the dangers of social isolation, we know there are so many positive benefits to high social connection. It increases longevity, increases self-esteem and empathy, better emotional regulation skills, lower rates of anxiety and depression. And conversely, from that negative feedback loop, it actually creates a positive feedback loop that enhances our well-being. So social connection, it has nothing to do with the amount of friends you have, the groups you're in, the connections on Facebook. It is a similarly subjective feeling of feeling close, feeling a sense of belonging, and feeling meaningful relationships with other people. We know that people who participate in volunteering in clubs, in religion, do feel more connected, according to a study by the AARP. There's a study out of Northwestern University that looks at superagers, and these are people over the age of 80 who have the mental and cognitive skills of much younger adults. And something that they all have in common was their really strong social network. Like I said earlier, this positive feedback loop is created when we are socially connected. And I wanted to share some research out of the Gottmans are a couple who does, they're very well known in the couples therapy world, but they have done research on bids for connection. And our bids for connection are these either verbal or non-verbal pleas for connection with one another. So I might say to my husband, will you help me fold this laundry? How was your day? Just small actions, small questions that I'm looking for a response from him. And if the bids are responded to, if he turns to me and engages with me, that builds trust and connection. But if he turns away from my bid or says, sorry, I can't, doesn't ask me about my day, starts to build resentment and disconnection. They really are these pleas to connect with one another. We're not saying connect with me, please, but when we're offering bids to one another, come sit with me, come on a walk with me, hold my hand while we watch TV. These are thought to be bids for connection, which is thought to be a really fundamental unit of emotional connection. So just as we know, nutrition and exercise and sleep are so important for our well-being, connection is just as vital. So it's similarly so deeply wired within us, this drive for social connection. It's thought that connection generates dopamine and triggers the release of neurotransmitters that help us enhance well-being, improve our health, ease pain. It's also protective against any kind of cognitive decline, and they also regulate stress and anxiety. We know that even 30 seconds of small talk can produce these feel-good, that dopamine or these feel-good chemicals. So have those conversations with people along the way, or say hello to people on a walk in your neighborhood. Another thing there's research around is your hugs. Make sure your hugs are at least 7 seconds long, because this will produce oxytocin, which is thought to be that love hormone, which we can all use a little bit more of right now. And I'm sure we'll all be doing a lot more hugging when this is over, so we can practice that. So what does meaningful connection ask of us? It's work. It asks for our undivided attention. It asks for our eye contact, for our active listening. I put a picture of a goldfish here because we know that humans have the attention span of a goldfish, which is about 8 seconds. So be aware when you start to check out and think about something else when you're talking to someone. Really focus on trying to stay present and coming back to where you are in this moment of connection with someone else. It also asks us to be non-judgmental. Accepting whoever it is that we're talking with for who they are, or accepting the situation for what it is. It just is avoiding labels of a person or a situation, just seeing it for what it is, and letting go of any expectations we have about the relationship or about what the person should be doing or should not be doing. It also requires some comfort with silence to really allow us to process and show that we are really taking in what another person is saying. So to really be comfortable with that space and that silence. Empathy, putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, and being vulnerable. You know, when someone shares something with us that might be really hard to talk about, we need to get real with them too. We need to show them that we can be vulnerable as well. And that really does add to meaningful connection. There are many traps of disconnection. Again, relationships are work. And so we have to be really aware of falling into traps. Being right is a really easy trap to fall into. I remember listening to a speaker talk about relationships who said, do you want to be right or do you want to be married? We have this insistence, some of us have this insistence of being right, or of blaming other people. And again, those are dangerous traps to fall into. We know that comparisons are the thief of joy. They really deplete any kind of joy or beauty you see in things when we're making comparisons. And expectations can just leave us feeling disappointed. So really be aware if you have expectations about things. We often do, we're just not even aware of them. Having an agenda or trying to be really controlling, being aware if that's something that you bring to interactions with other people. Obviously multitasking if you're on the phone, but you're also trying to make dinner, or you're on a Zoom and you're also sending emails, that erodes connection. We also know that is some disordered thinking about other people, about their behaviors. I included some distortions of thinking here, but these are really styles of thinking that are really unhelpful for ourselves and for our relationships. So they might be blaming ourselves for something, or overgeneralizing something, or this all or nothing thinking really black and white, maybe even using emotional reasoning or magnification, blowing things out of proportion. These disordered thinking styles can also affect our ability to connect with people. So if you are aware that you might be prone to personalizing things or overgeneralizing things, bring that into your awareness of your in your relationships and in your connection. Using social media really wisely. There's a wonderful documentary called what is it called? The Social Dilemma. And I would highly encourage you to check it out. It's just about the dangers of social media and the dangers of it on our brain. So this can also lead to disconnection. And just knowing that in relationships, conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. And how we repair our relationships really, how we choose to repair our relationships and choose to move through conflict can really have an impact on how connected we feel. So with all of this that you've learned today, I hope you know that you are not alone in any experience of loneliness that you have, and that help is available. And I hope you'll share that with others in your community who you might feel are at risk for feeling lonely. We all must take responsibility for the well-being of our community. Reach out to people who might be lonely, talk to strangers, have more 30-second conversations that generate that dopamine and those feel-good hormones. Talk about loneliness, talk about the need for connection. Just in my preparation for this talk, I've talked to so many people about loneliness, and it's been really eye-opening to hear other people's thoughts or experiences with it. So don't be afraid to talk about it. And if your community is building new things or creating new spaces, join those conversations and bring loneliness into that conversation. And then thinking about how could you better recognize loneliness in your community where you live or where you work? How can you bring about more moments of human contact? And how can we talk about loneliness in a way that reaches more people? I hope that we are all able to find more connection on the other side of this time, of this really difficult time, that maybe there is some post-traumatic growth that comes from this, so that we can find our way back to a really connected and engaged community and society. So thank you so much. I know we have a little bit of time for questions.
We do. We have about 5 minutes, so we'll be quick. No. Mary, your presentation today has created this amazing connection that's going on in the chat room. So I know that you haven't seen it, but we have built a community of connectors sharing resources in the chat room with one another. So if you haven't visited the chat room as an attendee yet, you might want to breeze through there real quick before you sign off, because there's some wonderful resources there. So the first question, Mary, is can you explain a little bit more about situational and or transient loneliness, and what does exactly that mean?
So situational would be more short, and transient would be more short term. So like I gave the example of COVID, this really is thought to be situational. Those of us who may not have experienced loneliness before and are experiencing it now in this pandemic, have a sense that when this is over, I can meaningfully engage again, and I can address my feelings of loneliness by connecting again. And transient is really just maybe it's short term. Maybe it's just for half a day. You've just noticed feelings of loneliness, and you've had this really strong desire to connect, and that connection reduced the feeling. So I think that's a difference between chronic loneliness and transient and situational loneliness, is when we respond to that alarm system that tells us we're lonely, we do something about it and we feel better.
Terrific. And in one of your slides, you also referred to a term, curated perfection. Someone is asking, can you describe that a little bit more in depth? What exactly that means?
Just this need to portray an image of ourselves and of our lives that's really perfect, when the truth is no one's life is perfect. But when someone else sees that, and especially if they're not feeling really great about their life or how things are going for them, that makes them feel all the worse, because they are looking at this person whose life seems perfect. So social media, I mean, people have this desire to make things look so ideal, so idealistic, and so incredible. And we know that that's not the whole story. They probably worked really hard to put that image up, or it probably took 20 takes to get that family photo, and people are in tears afterwards, and lots of fighting. But social media, because it snaps that one picture of things looking so amazing, that can leave the rest of us feeling, because we're comparing ourselves to it, feeling badly about ourselves. That's what I mean by that.
Okay, thank you so much. And there's a question about isolation, and that's really been created by that disconnection between families. And especially this particular question is asking about adult children not connecting so much with their parents. Any strategies of what either the parents or the adult children can do to help that situation and connect better?
Yeah, so if there's a geographic distance right now, and it's probably been for so many of us been 16 months since we've seen our parents, it's really hard. And I think that is a feeling so many of us are having, that longing to just be back together and hug one another. I think one thought I have is making sure that some of the connections, that we're not just doing it on Zoom on Sunday nights, or we're not just doing a phone call, Friday mornings, that we're mixing it up a little bit. We're also writing letters to them. We're not just doing Zoom, but we're using other modes of communication. And I think it probably depends on the person. If you can say, if you know that your parent really loves to receive pictures of things you've done or things your kids have done, is that something that would be really meaningful to them? Asking the person, having that conversation, this is so hard. I know we're both feeling such longing to be together. How can we make more meaningful communication? Do we both pick a recipe and make it together and then talk about it? Do we, what is it that we could both agree to do to find more of that, really that really meaningful connection. So.
And we have about 2 minutes left. So for the attendees that need to drop right at 3 o'clock, please feel free to do so. If you're able to stay on for just a couple more minutes, there's a few more questions in the chat room that we'd love to get to. So your slide specifically about the brain. So thank you for teaching us some anatomy today. There was a question, however, if you could take a little bit of a deeper dive into the amygdala control, and what exactly does that control in our brain?
So the amygdala is our processing of emotion. The amygdala is also related to things like fear. So we know that certain people who are more risk averse have a bigger amygdala than people who might be more, people who are more risk averse would have a smaller amygdala than people who are more willing to take risks. We've seen this in, rock climbers or certain adventure seekers, people who don't have a fear, who don't have the same level of fear in doing risky activities, their amygdala is a different size. I'm not a doctor, so I don't feel equipped to say more about the amygdala, but it really is an important element of our emotions and how we process our emotions, how we experience them, really.
Terrific. And so last question was around the co-housing. So first of all, I guess maybe this is more of a statement than a question. So thank you for bringing that up, because the chat room has blown up with resources in and around Denver with regards to co-housing. So thank you for bringing that up. The other thing is you brought up a little help, which we are all huge supporters of a little help and that village concept. And this weekend and next are actually their weekends of kindness.
Yes.
So if you're looking for a volunteer opportunity this weekend, I know they are still on the hunt for more volunteers to help our neighbors.
I will be there. Come join me.
I'll be there on Saturday. So urge you all to visit a Little Help website to find out a little bit more information about them. And then I love this one. I'm going to end on this one, but Ruth has asked if we can all get together for a glass of wine and continue this chat.
Yes.
So I think that's a great idea, Ruth. And we might have to incorporate that into future webinars. So with that, I'd like to thank Mary O'Hara again for presenting today and sharing with us so many resources and such good information that we can apply right away, either personally or in our work with older adults. So on that note, we will see you all next Thursday, same time, 2 p.m. for our next presentation about structure. And that'll be a nice follow-up to Mary's presentation today. So have a wonderful week, rest of the week and a weekend, and we'll see you next Thursday. Thanks everyone for coming. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.